Today's topic is basic engine management. We're going to talk about how electronics work in the vehicle, mainly as it pertains to engines. We'll talk inputs, outputs, and everything in between. Okay, so what is engine management? What does that mean? Well, we just think about that term. Engine management, we're talking about something that is managing all these crazy things that are going on inside of the engine. We have to worry about fuel, how much, when. We have to think about spark, when. We have a lot of things to think about. We have engine coolant temperature that plays a part. We've got lots of inputs that are going to play a part into changing all of these things. The amount of air entering the engine, and so we've got to have a way to monitor all of these variables. We need something that's going to take all of those inputs. We're going to need to think about, okay, based upon these inputs, what are we going to do? Like an algorithm, right? And then it's going to command some sort of output based upon the information given. That is not just engine management, but that's just computer control fundamentals. So right now we're going to talk about engine management as it pertains to, say, like the powertrain control module. But the same principles are going to apply to a TCM, a transmission control module, or a body control module, or any type of control module for that matter. In fact, most vehicles these days have their own module to control, say, just your windows or just your door locks. We keep adding more and more control modules because they're really efficient at doing things, and if we can sort of spread this out amongst the vehicle, and each control module has its own section that it's responsible for, and they're all going to be linked on a sort of loop or a bus where they can all communicate and help each other make decisions. It's almost like a little community of little brains or control modules inside our vehicle that work together on whatever the customer wants out of that vehicle. So at the very basis, there are really three things that are going to fall under this big category of management. So components that are part of this system are either going to fall under the category of inputs, which are mainly going to be sensors, things that gather information. They don't do any thinking. They're just simply the eyes you can think of. And I'll talk about some of those inputs here in a few moments. Then it's going to have to report to a module. So those are our control modules. Control modules we'll talk about later more in depth, but they're essentially the brain of it all, right? So input sensors, those are going to be like your nerves. Your control module is going to be very much like your brain. And then we've got our outputs, also known as control devices. These are going to be some sort of actuator, meaning that it does something. It doesn't think. It doesn't gather information necessarily. It's simply to do something, to open or close, or to create heat, or whatever it might be. This is where that work is going to be done, right? So our fuel injectors, the fuel pump, things like that. So we'll talk more about more outputs in a few moments here. Here's sort of in the picture an overview of some inputs, then our control module, and then our outputs, and then it's sort of just this loop of ongoing thing that's happening, right? My nerves are part of this whole system, right? You can think of your brain as like the control module for your whole body, right? Rather than a vehicle. This is our vehicle, right? So if I touch a hot fire, those nerves are going to send a signal to my control module telling me that, hey, we need to do something, you're getting hurt. My brain is going to command an output to my muscles to move my hand up. It's the same exact system for basically cars. Signals. Now, before we get into inputs, outputs, control modules, it's important to know how they communicate, because they're not communicating based off of the same language that we communicate off of. Instead, they communicate off of particular types of signals. Now, inputs, control modules, and outputs generally are dealing with two different types of signals. Not generally, always dealing with two different types of signals. We've got either an analog signal or a digital signal. This is very different from AC and DC. Remember back to our electrical videos, AC was going to be alternating current from positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative, right? Doesn't mean that it's a particular type of waveform. It could be digital waveform or it could be analog waveform for AC. So those are two different things. And then we had our DC, which was direct current, right? Always staying essentially positive. So, and that could also be analog or digital as well. The digital and analog terms are referring to the actual signals being put out. Now, the signals being put out are either going to be continuously variable, like this picture down here. The analog is what we call a sine, S-I-N-E waveform. And that sine waveform can be AC or DC, right? If it stays positive, it's a analog DC signal. If it goes back and forth, kind of like this signal in the digital is simply on or off. So analog is a signal that a lot of inputs may get back to the computer. And that is going to, like a magnetic pulse generator, is going to produce a sine wave, and other types of position sensors sometimes. So we get this signal mainly from inputs, not necessarily to outputs. Then your control unit is going to receive this. Now, control units don't always necessarily receive analog or understand analog. So they like to understand digital. So many times there's going to be something called an AD converter inside of your control unit that's going to convert your analog signal to a digital signal so your computer can understand that language. Then it takes that input and it then makes a decision and commands an output. Most of your outputs are going to receive digital signals. They're either going to be on or off, and we're going to talk more about that later when we get into controlled devices. Now, common inputs that you will see, when I say common, the ones here, it looks like a lot of inputs on our list. It's actually like the bare minimum. These are the sensors that your engine really need to make good decisions. And I'm just going to briefly go through them. I don't necessarily have a slide for each and every one of them, but I do have slides for some of them to go more in depth. But throttle position's absolutely necessary. If it is a throttle by wire, an accelerator position or a pedal position is going to be absolutely necessary. How can the engine give an output, or the throttle motor give an output, if it has no idea where the gas pedal's at, right? As far as throttle position, my computer doesn't know to give more fuel if it doesn't know where my throttle pedal's at and I'm just going to wide open throttle. It doesn't know to give me more fuel unless it knows where the throttle position's at. Engine coolant temperature is going to be a really big one as well. Engine coolant temperature has a big effect on how much fuel an engine's going to need. Intake air temperatures is also quite important. Crankshaft positions necessary. Oxygen sensors for our feedback loop. Manifold absolute pressure sensors, mass airflow sensors. They generally run one or the other, sometimes both. NOx sensor is super important for our ignition timing. Vehicle speed sensors. So all of these things are really important inputs, and there does seem to be a lot of them, but there's actually a whole lot more than just this. These are the really common ones you're going to see pretty much across the board. So let's talk a little bit about some of them. The throttle position sensor is exactly what it sounds like. It is a sensor that is there to monitor throttle position. So most of the time they're going to be some sort of potentiometer where we've got a reference voltage, aka sort of like a source voltage on TP sensors. A lot of times it's a 5-volt reference. Then we've got a ground side, so we've got a power and a ground, and somewhere in the middle is sort of where our gauge is, you can almost think of, and it's like a sweeping resistor you can think of. So as your throttle position changes, that's going to be on this shaft here, it's going to give a particular voltage depending on where it is on this resistor. So our voltage starts here, full 5 volts, and as it goes across, it gets used up no matter where the throttle position's at, and we've got 0 volts on this side. So this is the load in our circuit, right? Well, this is simply a gauge, almost like a voltmeter. And depending on where your throttle position is at, it's going to give you a different voltage. So we're going to start off with 5 volts, and it's going to go down further and further and further. And that is going to tell the computer where your throttle position's at. And it will let the computer know what it's doing. The computer will say, oh, we're at wide open throttle, we need more fuel. Then it will help command that. In real life, this is what they look like. So this is what your throttle body looks like. I should have got a more forward picture of the throttle plate itself, but there's a shaft in here and you've got a throttle plate. So as you open your throttle plate, your gas pedal is actually not a gas pedal, it's an air pedal. And that throttle plate opens, allowing more air. Well, your computer, through many sensors, realizes that there is more air and will then deliver more fuel. So that throttle plate is on the same shaft. Our sensor is connected to that, and it's going to change our signal voltage depending on how far open or closed your throttle plate is. Again, it's going to absolutely have an effect on air-fuel mixture. And then in some cases, wide open throttle, especially older vehicles that were, you could say, economical. When I say older, I'm talking like 80s, 90s, stuff like that. And even now, in some cases, since the engine is not really a powerful engine, it's meant to be an economical engine. When it goes to wide open throttle, it may actually turn off the air conditioning to give you just a couple more horsepower to get in front of the semi so you don't die. So in some cases, the TP sensor will essentially tell the computer, and the computer will say, oh, we need to shut the air conditioning off. So just a couple examples there for you. The next one would be coolant temperature. Coolant temperature, again, is very, very, very important. Most of the time, they're going to be what we call thermistors. There's two different types of thermistors. I don't want to get super into this or go down this rabbit hole, but most of the time, your coolant temperature sensors are going to be what we call NTC, or negative temperature coefficient. This means that the resistance of that coolant temperature sensor is actually going to decrease the hotter it gets. And the opposite. So I told you way back in the electrical videos that most components, when they get hot, resistance increases. This is true, and this would be true for a PTC thermistor, but in this particular case, coolant temperature sensors are generally going to be negative temperature coefficient, which is the exact opposite of everything else. So the hotter it gets, the less resistance it provides. And then it's going to report back to the PCM, the powertrain control module. Colder engines are going to require more fuel to stay running. Once it starts to warm up, everything gets back into where it's supposed to. We start to build a little bit more compression. All these extra different things happening. They get more efficient. Engines like to be hot in order to get good fuel economy as well as power. And so knowing the temperature of the engine is going to make a big difference on how our air-fuel mixture looks. The next input would be engine speed or position. This one is extra important. So this one will for sure cause the engine to not run if it goes bad. Others as well, but this one particularly. So pretty much all vehicles are going to have at least a crankshaft position sensor, if not a cylinder position sensor, which would be a CYP. CKP was crankshaft, CYP would be cylinder position. Some engines have camshaft position sensors, but not all. This input signal is to indicate the speed and position of the crankshaft. So in the last presentation, we talked a little bit about our crankshaft position sensor being a triggering device. It's still a triggering device. It just also happens to impact other things as well. And so the signal is not only needed for ignition timing, but it's also going to be needed for other inputs as well, fuel, things like that. So I talked a little bit about different sensors, but I'll talk just briefly a little bit more. We've got ones that are magnetic pulse generators, we've got Hall effects, and we've got optical sensors. These two top ones work sort of off of magnetic fields and changing. When the teeth get closer, the magnetic field increases, and as the teeth move further away from the sensor, it decreases. And so we generally will get a sine wave on our magnetic pulse generator, and then our Hall effect will either, these are very blatant windows and a very blatant sensor. See, this is sort of a different shape sensor. So we've got on-off signals here. This one's going to be a 3-wire. This one's going to be a 2-wire. Your optical sensor does the same thing, but instead of using magnetic fields through windows or through plates, sort of like how this reluctor wheel is here, instead it uses, it's still essentially like a reluctor wheel, except it doesn't have teeth. It's got little windows, kind of like if you remember when you were a kid and you had those little like round picture pieces, and you would set it in the toy, and you'd click through it, and it would rotate, change different pictures depending on the light showing through. That's that's a little bit ridiculous, but this optical sensor is kind of like that. It uses a photodiode and an LED to pick up light or not pick up light. This one's going to be a 3-wire as well, and it's going to produce a digital signal. The Hall effect's going to produce a digital signal, and then and we've got a magnetic pulse generator going to produce a sine wave signal.
Tengah sengaja bang.
Higher engine speeds are going to require more frequent ejection and
Yeah,
more
okay.
advanced spark timing, and so this is really, really important. Not to mention, we need some sort of reference. So generally, one of these teeth are going to be larger or smaller. Same with this wheel here, and same with, you can see here on our rotor plate, even for the optical, one of these windows is vertical, or I'm sorry, horizontal, while the others are going to be vertical. And it says here the 180 signal slit for number one cylinder. So that'd be TDC generally on your number one cylinder. So it has some sort of reference of where everything's at. And that's how those sensors work. Oxygen sensors, super duper important for what we call closed loop operation. If your engine doesn't have the information from the O2 sensor, your AFR or air fuel ratio sensor would also fall into this category. It is going to have a hard time knowing if the decisions it's making are good, and so they tend to go in sort of like a default mode or an open loop mode. So what we have here in this picture is our exhaust. So our engine would be toward the left of your screen. I think we're looking at it the same, hopefully. And the engine's going to go on the exhaust stroke, or one of the cylinders that are going on the exhaust stroke are going to send exhaust out through our exhaust manifold. And then our exhaust gases are going to continue to go down, and it's going to hit our first O2 sensor. Our first O2 sensor that the exhaust hits is called an upstream O2 sensor, and you can see it says HO2. That's going to refer to heated oxygen sensor. They do have heater units because they need to be hot, really hot, in order to work. So when your vehicle first starts up, it goes into what we call open loop, and I'll explain closed loop, open loop later a little bit more. I know I briefly spoke about it, but it has no idea if the mixture it's sending is too rich or too lean. And it doesn't matter because everything's cold, so it's going to lean on the too rich side. Once the O2 sensor heats up, it can be a lot more accurate, and then it's going to be able to report accurate information, everything going into closed loop. Your O2 sensors will generally go into, or O2 sensors and your PCM will generally go into closed loop operation, I mean, within 30 seconds to a minute, sometimes way faster now. New vehicles go into closed loop really, really fast because everything gets heated up really, really fast. So HO2 is heated oxygen sensor. The upstream is to tell the computer if the air fuel mixture was rich or lean. And if it was too rich, it'll send a signal letting the PCM know. The PCM will then shorten up the amount of time it opens up the fuel injectors for, and then it's going to burn it in the engine, and it's going to go back out to the upstream, and it's going to say, oh, that was not enough fuel, it's too lean. Computer will open back the fuel injector up a little bit longer, and it's going to chase this rich lean, rich lean, rich lean pretty much indefinitely. They do actually, because you think these are computers, they can be really smart. Why can't they just, they can't find the mixture? They can, but cycling, they call this oxygen cycling. If it goes rich lean, rich lean, rich lean, it actually produces a little bit more oxygen inside of our exhaust, which is actually going to help out our catalytic converter burn everything up. So we'll get into catalytic converters next week in emissions. But that's what our upstream O2 does. Now, if it's an air fuel ratio sensor, AFR sensors do the same thing, except they're a lot more accurate. So wouldn't it be nice if we knew how rich or how lean? That's what air fuel ratio sensors do. Oxygen or O2 sensors are what we call a narrow band sensor. It says too rich. I can't tell you how rich, but it's too rich. And so it's a little bit harder. It's less feedback, it's less information. And FAR sensors are what we call wideband sensors, meaning they tell us how rich, how lean. And again, these are inputs to the computer. Now, if we go down through here, this piece, it doesn't label it, but that's our catalytic converter. It's going to clean up our exhaust emissions. And downstream, we have another heated O2 sensor. Sometimes these are labeled sensor 1 and sensor 2. Sometimes they're upstream, downstream. The downstream O2 has nothing to do with how the engine is running. The downstream O2 is to see how much the catalytic converter cleaned up from the upstream O2. So it compares downstream to upstream to see how much the catalytic converter did. And if the catalytic converter is not doing a lot, then it's going to pop on a check engine light telling you to check your catalytic converter, essentially, if you know what you're looking for. Either that or the O2 is bad. So really important. I know a lot of people will go get their codes checked at auto parts store or by a buddy who's got a code reader. It's important to note that when you pick up a code on a vehicle, that code is not telling you what the problem is. That's not how this works. It's telling you the area of the problem, or not even necessarily the area, but it tells you what it doesn't like. So if you get a code for an oxygen sensor, you can't look at the code as a general oxygen sensor code. Is the oxygen sensor bad, or does the computer not like what the oxygen sensor is reading? Because those are two different things. If the oxygen sensor is doing its job correctly, it's just getting bad readings because there is bad exhaust coming out, that's another problem. The problem's not the oxygen sensor. The problem could be if you're running too rich and you're getting a code for something particular, it could be a rich issue. Now we got to figure out why too much fuel is getting into the engine or not enough fuel is getting into the engine. Or what if the heating circuit is bad on the O2 sensor? So it's not the sensor itself, but it's the heating wiring, which is usually not the case. If you get a heater code, it's generally a bad heater in the O2, but there's ways to test that. So you never want to see a code and be like, oh, it says oxygen sensor, I need to replace the oxygen sensor. That's not necessarily what you want to do, because it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just saying, hey, this reading's wonky, you should probably take a look at this. And then you have to decide, is that a reading for a bad sensor? If so, I need to check the sensor, not just replace it. Remember, we diagnose things. We don't just change parts. That is what makes us diagnosticians. That's what makes us real technicians that are worth money. If you're just a parts changer, we can teach anybody to do that. You really want to make yourself valuable by learning how to diagnose things, not just say, well, I've got this known good part, I'm just going to change it. It's easy to get lazy. You want to get good at diagnosing. This is bad because customers will always really like if you hand a part and say, we tested this, it's bad because it has high resistance, it's shorted inside, whatever it might be. So I'll go ahead and step off my soapbox there. It's really important to diagnose. Moving along here, we've got another input that is for our airflow. Now, this isn't on all vehicle systems. Some vehicles will use airflow sensors, others will use MAP sensors, and we'll talk about that in a slide here or so. Airflow sensors are going to be in your intake somewhere. So down here is a picture of what one might look like generally after your air box. This is really important because if you're getting lean conditions, sometimes what will happen is air is leaking into the intake, let's say through a crack that is not being monitored by this airflow sensor. And so it thinks it has this much air, but it actually has this much air. So it's really only giving fuel for this much air, but you're getting this much air. And so we've got too much air, not enough fuel. So that's a really, really common problem. That can also happen when this mass airflow sensor goes bad. How did these sensors work? Well, back in the days, we used to use volume airflow sensors. Volume airflow sensors had like a little door, and the more air went through it, moved this door, and it was very much like a throttle position sensor in that respect. The problem was it tells us volume of air. It actually doesn't tell us the density of air. And I can't emphasize this enough. Air density is key. Cold air is condensed, meaning it's going to contain more oxygen. And if you really want to know that key to horsepower is not just more fuel, but we also need more oxygen. The limiting factor is oxygen. We can always add more fuel, right? We can always add more fuel. The computer can make changes on the fly to give you more fuel. What it has a hard time getting is oxygen. That's why people put on turbochargers, superchargers, or nitrous. You're adding more oxygen, and then obviously you'll make provisions for more fuel, like bigger fuel injectors or a larger fuel pump to meet the oxygen level, right? So it's really, really important to know how much air is coming into the engine, but it's even more important to know the density or oxygen content. Now, we don't have exact oxygen content through a mass airflow sensor, but a mass airflow sensor, rather than a little door that would give us a volume number, up here in the top picture, it's going to have a little hot wire that air will flow through, and it's going to cool down that hot wire. And depending on how well it cools down this hot wire is going to determine the temperature, which also gives us air density. So if I've got more cold air, if I've got a box, this a 1 foot by 1 foot box that is sealed, and I have 100-degree air, versus the same box, maybe another box that has 60-degree air. There's going to be more oxygen in the 60-degree air box, which means if that air is going into the engine, it requires more fuel than the box of 100-degree air, if that makes sense. So we don't use volume airflow sensors very much anymore for that reason. Mass airflow sensors give us more information. Now, if it doesn't use an airflow sensor, it might use an engine load sensor. This system is going to be what we call a speed density system, and it means it uses a pressure sensor instead. We call this a MAP. So instead of a MAF, mass airflow, this is a MAP, manifold absolute pressure sensor. And it is a pressure sensor, and I know this might be a hard picture to see, but this is an intake manifold. I know it doesn't look like one, but a lot of new vehicles use composite manifolds instead of metal manifolds. So this is a composite intake manifold, and we've got a MAP sensor that it's got essentially a little vacuum nipple that is taking pressure inside the intake manifold, and it's going to have a little wafer inside, and that wafer is going to deform depending on how much vacuum is inside the intake manifold. And it has a little chamber inside that has a perfect vacuum, and it compares it to that. Now, instead of monitoring how much air is entering the engine, instead what they're doing is they're monitoring intake vacuum to determine how much fuel to put in. So if I have a lot of vacuum, I'm probably at idle. And I know we talked about vacuum a little while back, but if I'm at idle, I've got a lot of vacuum at the highest amount of vacuum, and then I don't need a lot of fuel. So that high vacuum number says you don't need a lot of fuel, right? If I have low vacuum, I'm at wide open throttle, I have atmospheric pressure inside of that intake manifold. It sees atmospheric pressure. That MAP sensor reports to the computer, and the computer says, oh, we're at wide open throttle. We need a lot of fuel, right? And so it utilizes vacuum to indicate load, like idle or wide open throttle, and it will determine the fuel output from that. So it's either going to use an airflow system or a speed density system. Very rarely, but sometimes you'll see both of them. Can't have too much info. Engine knock sensors are going to be a very important part of the system as well. This goes back to our ignition lecture. Ignition systems are constantly changing with the new electronic style. We're changing ignition timing on the fly. And what the computer actually does in order for best performance and fuel economy is it'll start to advance ignition timing until it hears a knock, and then it'll back up, advance, back up, advance. So we're always as advanced as we possibly can without creating a problem. Knock can be created by not just excessive load on the engine. So let's say ignition timing can't keep up on older designs, but ignition timing that's too advanced will create a knock. And then also overheating the engine. This happens because of pre-ignition. So pre-ignition can happen because, or I'm sorry, detonation can happen because of hotspots, which will cause pre-ignition, so on and so forth. And so engine knock sensors are probably the number one for ignition timing that is needed, as well as engine RPM. Engine knock and engine RPM are really, really big for ignition timing. Okay, that was a lot of inputs. Now let's talk a little bit about the control module itself. So these are, they used to be larger units. They seem to just get smaller and smaller, but we're also seeing, again, more and more of them throughout the whole car. It is not uncommon for new vehicles to have 40 plus computers, especially BMWs, like luxury vehicles with a lot of electronics. So the control module is your computer. It is your brain. And like I said, we've got control modules for a ton of stuff. In this lecture, we're going to talk about more PCM, or powertrain control modules. So this down here, the last three are the same no matter what type of module it is. It's going to take input from sensors. It's going to take that input, process it. They essentially use like map tables. We'll get into that maybe when you get into a tune-up class, but it's going to process this information. All right, I've got this much RPM, I've got this much air, and this and this and this. This is the amount of fuel and ignition timing that we are going to do. And then it's also going to be responsible for storing information, right? It's going to remember lots of different things in the vehicle. I mean, even as basic as the clock, right? But what about all the settings in the vehicle, your radio stations, and so on and so forth? It also remembers what your engine has been needing. So your computer, your control module is learning. It learns. Obviously, it has a range of which it can learn, and we'll talk about that later. But the control module is always learning, and so it knows, okay, what about what climate or what elevation you live at? That's going to change the density of the air. And so the computer is going to make those accommodations. Well, it's going to store that information. That way, when I go to turn my car back on, it doesn't have to relearn all that information. It just goes off of what it last saw. And it takes information from all sorts of stuff and remembers it so it can continue to make consistent decisions. And then obviously it's going to make a decision, command and output to some sort of actuator, which I had already mentioned. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I did already mention that sensor signals may need to be converted, and so we might have an AD converter, or even for back and forth from that. The PCM is simply one module that will generally be on some sort of bus, and you can see this PCM is also connected to and communicates with the transmission module, with the instrument panel that might be its own module. The body control module is its own piece. And like I said, I mean, we could have up to 40 computers that are on this bus here. And that's generally how they work. If you take a computer controls class, this is the bread and butter of that. You're going to get a lot more in depth on that and the diagnosis involved. Now, many of you have probably already heard of OBD, or onboard diagnostics. Onboard diagnostics was simply kind of like an operating system, if you want to think about it, except it was not necessarily, it's not like a Microsoft in that respect. It's simply the computer programming that people used. But the problem is that nothing was standardized. So what Chevy used was different from what Ford used, which was different from what Toyota and Honda used. And everybody had different names for sensors, had different names for connectors, had different connectors to connect. Some of them you could use a scan tool, others you couldn't use a scan tool, and you couldn't use the same scan tool on a Ford as you could a Dodge or something, you know, so it was all over the place. Some of them, instead of using scan tools, you would put it into a diagnostic mode and it would blink a light at you, and you would have to pretty much kind of read a little Morse code on that and get the code from there. And then a code 14 on a Nissan would be different than a code 14 on a Toyota. And so there was stuff all over the place. So even though it was a step in the right direction, it got very confusing to work on cars. I don't I definitely don't envy anyone who was technicians, like say in pre-96, essentially 80s and early 90s would have been a really big pain. You'd have to have so much extra diagnostic equipment. So then in 1996, we went to onboard diagnostics second generation, or also known as OBD2, which, by the way, the term, I'm just going to say it right now for anybody who's heard this. If you hear the term OBD0, that's not a thing. Those are generally Honda people. It was just simply OBD. Now, for Honda, there might have been a generation of OBD that came after another OBD before OBD2. Things did work a little bit differently in the from the early 90s to late 80s and stuff like that. So there's no such thing as OBD0. It's OBD and OBD2. And now they haven't really labeled it OBD3, but we're essentially in that era, and I'll talk more about that. But the cool part about OBD2, it made technicians' lives so much easier because they made this, the government standardized this for all the manufacturers sold in America. When I say standardized, they made, instead of each manufacturer having their own trouble codes, a code 14 on a Honda is different from a code 14 on a Toyota. They said, all right, that's it. Everybody's using the same codes. So a random misfire random misfire on a Honda code is the same random misfire on a Toyota code. Also, common DLC, and if you're not familiar with what DLC stands for, it is Data Link Connector, which is what we have in the picture here on the right. Your scan tool plugs into that Data Link Connector, and you can see underneath the dash here, that is that's going to be the vehicle's end of the Data Link Connector. Now, this Data Link Connector was different from vehicle to vehicle, even same manufacturer, but different vehicles, it had different Data Link
Kita keren deh,
connectors.
bertiga
So it was
begini.
really, really irritating prior to OBD2. OBD2 said, all right, everybody's using the...
Mochi.
Bang, mau beli mobil nggak bang?
Mobil apa bang?
Apa ada? Ini bang, mobil Supra, Evo 9, Evo 6, BMX 6 bang.
Nggak ada duit bang, mahal semua.
Emang, abang ada budget berapa bang?
Belum ada duit sih bang.
Walah, apa pula nih? Halo, gua nggak ada duit, lu minta duit mulu. Ape, mau ape? Nggak ada duit gue.
Halo, di mana?
Nge-gym, balkot.
Coba lihat yang pakai sarung.
Itu di belakang tuh. Tendang. Der.
Weh, masuk penjara lagi anjing.
Ini si botak.
Awas, saya baru keluar dari penjara. Nggak lihat nih tato? Lihat nih, tato dari senior.
Dijual Supra GR, Evo 9, Evo 6, BMW X6,
Diam lu,
Rubicon.
mobil aja mesti pinjem bro.
Bang, tolong bang, saya dipalakin sama botak. Ada polisi.
Lapor.
Suka mukul, coba baru treatment anjing.
Nggak takut sama polisi, itu udah jadi sahabat itu polisi.
Ntar gua cucuk lu, gua buang ke laut lu.
Cucuk sini. Nah, ayo ke gudang sini ambil cucuk kan, ayo. Cok, gua ngebacok orang tadi cok di belakang puskes.
Ih, ada yang pingsan, bantuin gak sih? Kasian.
Ngasih gue tembakau sel.
Iya. Orang
Apa anjir,
tahu.
cuma satu doang.
Kemarin dimasukin sama Oksi.
Cuma satu doang.
Ya mau
Gak ada.
berapa?
Nggak ada harganya.
Iya, otot G, iya.
Itu si Adri. Orang lagi pingsan di atas itu.
Ya udah bang, terusin lagi ya, ke dokter ya bang. Dijual BMW X6 Supra JRT kanan, Evo 9 kanan, Evo 6 kanan. Apa lagi ya?
Terus.
Rubicon kiri.
Terus.
Tas nih.
Apa ya mobil apa? NTT kanan. Apa lagi ya? NTT murah tuh mobilnya.
Jual nih M3 nih.
Dijual M3 200 ribuan aja udah full kosme.
Mobil siapa, woi?
Mobil lu lah yang warnanya krem gitu. Warnanya nggak jelas.
Itu abu-abu gak sih?
Gue
Abu-abu
sengaja nih pakai tenggorokan
abu-abu
3.
buat
Vanilla pink.
vanilla.
Minimal bagi makanan lah sel.
Oh iya nih, bentar.
Sel.
Yang mau ke Cubung ada di Andre. Rubicon sini 1 juta.
Bapak lo.
10 juta
kan?
buat Ryzen.
Enggak,
10 juta
Rubicon
buat
2,5 juta doang. Murah anjing. Di dealer 3 juta lebih, Cok.
Ini di dealer dikasih. Jual dulu.
Kenapa bang?
Aduh, dijual. BMW X6 kanan, Supra JR kanan, Evo 9 kanan, Evo 6 kanan. Yuk pindah yuk, Sel, mau ikut nggak?
Di atas.
Yang mendarat baru aku sih yang di balkon. Ada raja situ bang. Gak ada yang kerja tukang kayu kah?
Mana si Andri tadi?
Minggu depan, Mbak.
Kan
Oke,
minggu
Mbak.
libur.
Heeh.
Kamu magang ulang berarti, magang lagi. Tapi magangnya magang pemerintah bukan magang sekolah.
Heeh, oke.
Magang sekolah beda ya sama magang.
Tinggi bro. Kota itu loh strike.
BMW X6 kanan, Bang, sama hoodie kita bang. Mending meditasi bareng bang. Apa?
Ke rumah sakit. Oh, berapa?
Hup.